The dining room felt like a freezing interrogation chamber. My older sister, Clara, tapped her manicured nails against her crystal wine glass. The sharp, rhythmic clinking echoed through the suffocating silence of the massive house. "You are actually wearing that threadbare polyester disaster to a federal courtroom?" she asked, her voice dripping with pure disgust. She gestured toward the faded navy jacket hanging carefully over my wooden chair. "The estate judge is going to take one look at those frayed cuffs and laugh us out of the building." She took a slow sip of her expensive burgundy wine. "You look like a tired security guard who completely gave up on life." I did not raise my voice, nor did I break her gaze. I carefully set my fork down on the porcelain plate, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table. "The judge will not care about the fabric of this suit, Clara," I said quietly, letting the silence settle. "He is only going to care about the classified silver pin bolted to the inside pocket." Clara simply rolled her eyes, completely blind to the reality of who was sitting across from her. To understand how we got here. 2 weeks earlier, the heavy wooden doors of my late father's study slammed shut. The echo vibrated through the floorboards. Our father had passed away suddenly, leaving behind a sprawling estate in the wealthy suburbs of Oakhaven. The reading of his will was supposed to be a simple private family matter. Instead, it became a vicious battleground. Clara paced back and forth across the Persian rug, her sharp heels sinking into the expensive wool. She was a corporate executive who measured human worth entirely by bank accounts and luxury car keys. She had spent her entire life climbing corporate ladders and looking down on anyone below her. I sat in the corner armchair, perfectly still. My hands rested calmly on my knees. I had learned long ago that unnecessary movement only wasted energy. Discipline was not just a word to me. It was the strict framework of my entire existence. I wore simple, unmarked clothes. I drove a 10-year-old sedan. To Clara, my lifestyle was a symbol of absolute failure. "We are taking this directly to the probate court," Clara announced, turning on her heel to glare at me. "The estate distribution is completely unbalanced." "Father left the property exactly how he wanted it," I replied softly. The antique grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner, marking the slow, heavy passage of time. Clara laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound that held zero warmth. "He left the northern acreage to you, Julian. You, a man who disappears for years at a time, working some mysterious government desk job, making pennies. What are you going to do with premium real estate? Build a miserable little shack?" I did not flinch. I let her insulting words hang in the air, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she desperately craved. It was a tactical response I had mastered in environments far more dangerous than this dusty study. When facing an aggressive adversary, absolute silence is often your most devastating weapon. She crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets catching the weak afternoon sunlight pouring through the blinds. "I have already hired the most aggressive litigation firm in the state. They will rip his testament apart. The judge will see that I am the only one fit to manage the family legacy." "You are letting your pride completely cloud your judgment," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and steady. "Do not talk to me about pride," she snapped, her face flushing bright red with sudden anger. "I have built an empire. I demand respect in every room I walk into. You demand nothing. You just exist." She was so blindly certain of her superiority because she only looked at the shallow surface of things. She saw the cheap clothes, the old car, and the quiet demeanor. She falsely assumed that an absence of flashy wealth meant an absence of actual power. I stayed completely calm because my authority did not come from a bank account, a designer label, or a loud voice. I stood up slowly. I did not slouch. My posture was a rigid, unbreakable line, forged by years of grueling physical and mental standards that Clara could never begin to comprehend. I walked over to the mahogany desk and picked up the thick manila envelope containing the official court summons. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the end of the month. "I will be at the courthouse on the 24th, I told her, my voice carrying a quiet, heavy weight that made her blink in momentary surprise. "I will stand by Father's final wishes." "Fine," Clara spat, aggressively grabbing her designer trench coat from the brass rack. "But do me a massive favor. Try not to look homeless when you stand in front of the federal magistrate. I have a major professional reputation to maintain in this city." After the heavy front door slammed shut, Leaving me completely alone in the vast, empty house, I walked up the winding staircase to my small guest room. I opened my weathered green canvas duffel bag. Inside, beneath a stack of plain white undershirts, lay a reinforced steel lockbox. I spun the combination dial. The heavy mechanism clicked with satisfying metallic precision. I lifted the heavy lid, revealing a neatly folded dark navy jacket. To the untrained, arrogant eye, it looked like cheap, mass-produced polyester. It was faded around the broad shoulders, and the cuffs were slightly frayed from intense, abrasive wear. But this was not a suit bought off a discount rack. I ran my thumb slowly over the heavy fabric. This uniform had survived things that would completely shatter Clara's fragile, sheltered worldview. Hidden deep inside the left breast pocket, pinned tightly against the heavy nylon lining, was a small, heavy silver star. It was a highly classified commendation that did not exist on any public civilian records. It was a quiet, heavy symbol of massive sacrifice, issued only to a phantom few who operated in the darkest shadows of the world. I closed the steel box and locked it again. The court date was rapidly approaching. Clara was busily preparing for a shallow war of money, expensive lawyers, and social status. She had absolutely no idea that she was walking into a room governed by strict federal law, where true rank is recognized in total, absolute silence. Growing up, Clara and I shared the exact same roof, but lived in entirely different universes. She was a hurricane of blind ambition, demanding attention, expensive gifts, and constant social validation from everyone around her. I was the exact opposite. I found deep comfort in the quiet. I preferred the structural safety of discipline over the chaotic, empty noise of popularity. She had spent our entire childhood trying to make me feel small. I had simply stopped reacting to her insults when I turned 16. To our extended family, Clara was the golden child who had successfully conquered the corporate real estate world. I was the disappointing, silent phantom. My official cover story, the one I had strictly maintained for over a decade, was incredibly boring. I told everyone I worked as a low-level logistics coordinator for a commercial freight company. It perfectly explained the long, unexplained absences, the sudden international trips, and the modest, unflashy income. It was the perfect lie. Nobody ever asks a freight coordinator for exciting stories. Because of this carefully crafted illusion, Clara viewed me as a pathetic underachiever. She falsely believed that power was something you bought, wore, and flaunted in front of cameras. She did not understand that true, lethal power is completely invisible until the exact moment it is required. The night before the federal probate hearing, Clara unexpectedly summoned me to her sprawling estate for dinner. It was definitely not a gesture of sisterly affection or reconciliation. It was a highly calculated ambush. She wanted to completely break my resolve and force a cheap settlement before we ever stepped foot inside the courthouse. I drove my faded, 10-year-old sedan through the winding, manicured streets of Oak Haven. Heavy rain slicked the dark asphalt, reflecting the warm, golden security lights of the massive, gated mansions. I pulled up to Clara's towering iron security gates. The intercom buzzed aggressively in the damp air before the heavy metal doors slowly swung open. I parked my dull, weather-beaten car directly next to her husband's brand-new, imported luxury SUV. The financial contrast was almost comical. I killed the engine. The silence inside my cold car was heavy, familiar, and comforting. I took a slow, measured breath, centering my mind for the psychological warfare ahead. Tomorrow, the estate judge would legally decide the fate of our father's northern acreage. Clara desperately wanted to bulldoze the dense, ancient forest to build a sprawling, lucrative shopping complex. Our father had explicitly wanted the land preserved as a wildlife sanctuary. I was the only thing standing in her aggressive path. I grabbed my cheap canvas bag, which contained my carefully folded clothes for the court, and walked up the pristine limestone front steps. Before I could even knock on the heavy brass ring, the massive mahogany door swung violently open. Richard, Clara's husband, stood in the bright doorway holding a crystal tumbler of amber scotch. He was a ruthless corporate defense attorney with a permanently smug, arrogant expression. He looked me up and down, his judging eyes pausing deliberately on my scuffed, waterproof leather boots. "Julian," Richard said, flashing a hollow, perfectly white smile that did not reach his cold eyes. We honestly did not think your rusted car would actually make it up the steep hill. It gets me exactly where I need to go, Richard, I replied. My tone was entirely flat and devoid of emotion. I stepped inside the cavernous, echoing foyer. The massive house smelled of expensive floor wax and roasted rosemary lamb. Everything was immaculate, cold, and aggressively wealthy. There was absolutely no genuine warmth in this home. I followed him into the formal dining room, keeping my footsteps deliberately light and completely silent against the imported marble. Clara was already seated at the head of the long, transparent glass dining table. She wore a tailored silk designer dress, looking much more like a ruthless CEO about to fire an incompetent employee than a sister hosting a private family dinner. "Sit down," Clara commanded sharply, gesturing to the stiff, high-backed chair at the completely opposite end of the long table. "We have a lot of legal ground to cover before tomorrow morning." I placed my canvas bag gently on a small side chair and took my designated seat. A private chef in a crisp white apron silently placed a plate of delicately arranged food in front of me, then quickly vanished back into the stainless steel kitchen. "I am going to make this very simple and painless for you," Clara said, leaning forward aggressively. She slid a crisp, folded piece of heavy bank paper across the sleek glass table. It stopped mere inches from my ceramic plate. "That is a certified cashier's check. It is for $50,000. That is more money than a freight coordinator makes in 2 entire years." I did not look down at the check. I kept my eyes locked steadily on hers. "All you have to do," she continued, her voice dripping with artificial, sugary sweetness, "is sign the legal waiver, releasing your claim as the estate executor. You take the money, you go back to your sad little rented apartment, and I handle the complicated land development." "The land is strictly not for sale," I said calmly. "Father wanted it completely untouched. I will honor that." Richard scoffed loudly, taking a long, arrogant sip of his expensive scotch. "Be reasonable, Julian. You have absolutely no legal resources. You have no professional standing. When we walk into that federal courtroom tomorrow, the judge is going to look at our elite legal team and then look down at you. It will be an absolute slaughter." I reached into my deep coat pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, hard edges of my solid titanium service identification card. It was a highly restricted, Level 5 credential that granted me instant clearance to secure rooms Richard did not even know existed. I kept it carefully hidden in the dark. I did not need to boast or shout about my status. True respect is always earned through decisive action, never through loud volume. "I am perfectly comfortable with my current position," I stated quietly, refusing to break eye contact. Clara's eyes narrowed into dangerous, calculating slits. She absolutely hated my unbreakable, calm demeanor. She thrived on loud conflict and desperate panic, and my absolute refusal to break infuriated her deeply. She stood up abruptly, her wooden chair scraping harshly against the smooth marble floor. The battle was officially beginning. The grand, glittering chandelier above Clara's dining table bathed everything in a harsh, unforgiving light. The tension in the cavernous room was thick enough to choke on. The private chef had vanished completely, leaving only the three of us locked in a vicious, silent staring contest. I picked up my silver fork, deliberately moving with slow, controlled precision. I cut a small piece of the rosemary lamb, placed it in my mouth, and chewed quietly. The absolute silence in the dining room amplified the small clinking of the cutlery. Clara slammed her manicured hands flat against the thick glass table. "Are you deaf, Julian, or just completely delusional?" she snapped, her voice cracking slightly with raw frustration. "That check is more money than you have ever seen in your miserable, pathetic life. Take it." "I heard you perfectly," I replied, my voice steady and completely void of anger. "But the land is not a financial asset to me, Clara. It is a promise. I am keeping it." Richard, sitting to her right, leaned forward aggressively, resting his tailored silk elbows on the glass. He flashed that same cold, arrogant smile. "Julian, you do not understand how federal probate courts actually function. It is a brutal theater. It is about power, prestige, and raw presentation. You do not even own a proper tailored suit." "I have exactly what I need for tomorrow," I said softly, taking a sip of the iced water. Clara laughed out loud. It was a sharp, patronizing sound that echoed off the high marble walls. It was the exact sound she used when destroying smaller companies in boardroom negotiations. She pointed an accusatory, shaking finger toward the cheap canvas bag I had left on the small side chair near the grand entrance. "Oh, please do not tell me you are wearing that awful, tragic thing you brought in that bag," she sneered, her eyes gleaming with absolute malicious delight. "I saw it when you were packing your cheap sedan last week. It looks like you bought it at a tragic thrift store." I did not flinch. I kept my breathing slow and even. "It is a standard uniform. It is perfectly clean and pressed. It will suffice for the judge." "Suffice?" Clara yelled, her sudden volume making the crystal glasses on the table vibrate violently. "This is not a warehouse loading dock, Julian. This is a high-profile federal magistrate hearing. There will be corporate journalists there covering the estate land dispute. You are going to publicly humiliate our entire family name." She marched aggressively around the long table, stopping directly behind my chair. I could smell her overpowering, expensive perfume. She leaned in close to my ear, dropping her voice to a vicious, venomous whisper. "You have always been an absolute failure," she hissed, her breath hot and full of deeply rooted resentment. "You failed out of college. You disappeared into some pathetic delivery job. You have absolutely nothing to show for your life. You are a ghost, Julian. A completely useless ghost." I slowly placed my silver knife down parallel to the fork. I closed my eyes for exactly 2 seconds. In my mind, I was back in a deafening, sand-swept valley thousands of miles away, where a single mistake meant instant death. I remembered the heavy weight of the tactical gear, the sharp smell of ozone, and the unbreakable bond of men who fought in total, absolute silence. I remembered the discipline that kept us alive when the world burned around us. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Richard. He was smirking, thoroughly enjoying the brutal verbal execution of his brother-in-law. "My life choices are not up for debate tonight," I stated firmly, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a heavy, dangerous authority that made Richard's smug smile falter for a fraction of a second. "I am here to finalize the logistics of tomorrow's transportation. We are taking separate cars." Clara practically stomped her expensive heel into the floor. She grabbed the handle of my canvas bag and violently unzipped it. She pulled out the dark, folded jacket. The faded navy fabric looked completely out of place against the gleaming white marble and crystal of her dining room. "Look at this pathetic disaster," she mocked loudly, holding the jacket up by the collar like it was a diseased animal. "The cuffs are practically shredded. The fabric is utterly stiff. You are actually wearing this threadbare polyester nightmare to a federal courtroom?" She shook the jacket violently, completely oblivious to the hidden, reinforced pockets and the classified tactical stitching that held the garment together. To her, it was just cheap, worthless trash. "The estate judge is going to take one look at those frayed cuffs and laugh us out of the building," she continued, tossing the jacket carelessly onto the pristine glass table. It slid a few inches before stopping near the $50,000 check. "You look like a tired security guard who completely gave up on life." I did not jump up. I did not yell. I simply reached across the table, picked up the jacket, and carefully folded it back into its exact, proper military configuration. I brushed a microscopic piece of lint off the heavy shoulder seam. I treated the garment with total, unwavering respect. "The judge will not care about the fabric of this suit, Clara," I said quietly, letting the silence settle heavily in the grand room. "Oh, really?" Richard mocked, crossing his arms aggressively. "And what exactly is he going to care about, Julian? Your vast knowledge of cardboard shipping boxes?" I picked up the canvas bag and slung it smoothly over my shoulder. I stood up, towering over Clara for the first time all evening. The sudden shift in physical dynamics made her take a quick, nervous step backward. I looked her dead in the eyes, my expression completely blank and unreadable. "He is only going to care about the classified silver pin bolted to the inside pocket," I said softly, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor blade. Clara simply rolled her eyes, completely blind to the terrifying reality of who was actually standing in her dining room. She huffed, turning her back on me in a display of ultimate dismissal. "Be at the courthouse at 8 sharp, Julian," she ordered without looking back. "Try to stand in the back. Do not speak unless spoken to." I walked toward the heavy front doors, the silence of the massive house pressing against my back. Tomorrow, the absolute truth was going to shatter her perfect, sheltered world. The federal courthouse in downtown Oak Haven was a massive, imposing structure of polished granite and towering oak doors. It smelled distinctly of old paper, harsh floor wax, and nervous sweat. At exactly 8 in the morning, the heavy wooden benches inside courtroom 4B were already packed with aggressive lawyers, bored clerks, and a handful of local journalists whispering over their glowing tablets. Clara and Richard sat at the plaintiff's gleaming mahogany table, looking like they had just stepped out of a luxury magazine photo shoot. Clara wore a sharp, custom-tailored white pantsuit that practically screamed aggressive wealth. Richard wore a 3-piece charcoal suit, aggressively flipping through a stack of legal briefs, his expensive gold watch catching the harsh fluorescent lights above. I sat alone at the defendant's table, directly across the wide aisle. I was wearing my dark navy uniform. It was perfectly pressed, but the fabric was undoubtedly stiff, faded, and heavily worn around the reinforced shoulders. The frayed cuffs that Clara had mocked so viciously rested completely motionless on the smooth wood in front of me. I did not fidget. I sat with the rigid, unbreakable posture ingrained in me by years of brutal, unforgiving discipline. The bailiff, an older man with tired eyes and a thick gray mustache, stood near the heavy side door. He announced the arrival of the Honorable Judge Thomas Vance. Everyone in the crowded room immediately stood up. The silence that fell over the courtroom was instant and heavy. Judge Vance was a stern, intimidating man in his late 60s, known for tearing apart arrogant corporate lawyers with absolute ruthlessness. He took his seat at the high, elevated bench, adjusting his thick black robes. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down exactly once. The sharp, cracking sound echoed violently off the high marble walls. "Be seated," Judge Vance ordered, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. Clara immediately leaned over to Richard and whispered loudly enough for the front row to hear. "Look at him," she scoffed softly, throwing a disgusted glance in my direction. "He looks like a complete joke sitting there in that cheap, shiny fabric. The judge is going to destroy him." Judge Vance opened the thick manila folder containing the estate dispute. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes quickly scanning the preliminary arguments submitted by Richard's elite legal team. He flipped a page, his face remaining entirely unreadable. "Counselor," the judge barked, looking directly at Richard over the rim of his glasses. "You are petitioning to completely overturn the explicit final wishes of the deceased regarding the northern acreage. Your primary argument is that the current executor, Mr. Julian Vance—" "Wait." The judge suddenly stopped reading. He leaned forward slightly, his thick eyebrows furrowing in deep confusion. He dragged a thick finger down the page, tracing a specific sequence of numbers listed next to my full legal name. It was an encrypted, highly classified federal identification code that I was legally required to provide on all federal documents. To an untrained civilian, it looked like a random string of meaningless digits. To a federal judge with top-level security clearance, it was a blinding neon sign. Judge Vance looked up from the folder. He locked eyes with me across the large room. For exactly 5 seconds, the entire courtroom was perfectly, suffocatingly silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the massive air conditioning unit vibrating in the ceiling. I held his gaze. I did not blink. I kept my expression completely blank, respectfully acknowledging the silent communication passing between us. The judge slowly closed the heavy manila folder. He took off his reading glasses and set them carefully down on the polished wood. The aggressive, intimidating demeanor he usually carried vanished entirely. His face visibly softened, replaced by a look of profound, heavy respect. "Mr. Julian Cross," the judge said softly, his voice echoing strangely in the quiet room. "I am reading this identification code correctly, am I not? Verification string Alpha 79er Echo?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied evenly, my voice cutting through the thick silence. "That is correct." Richard immediately jumped up from his expensive leather chair, throwing his hands out in a gesture of pure arrogance. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client's brother is a low-level freight coordinator. We have submitted massive amounts of financial evidence proving his complete inability to manage a multi-million-dollar estate." Judge Vance slowly turned his head to glare at Richard. The look on his face was one of absolute, terrifying disgust. Sit down, counselor, the judge ordered softly, but with a dangerous, lethal edge that made Richard immediately drop back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. The judge stood up from his high leather chair. The sudden movement sent a shockwave of confusion through the crowded courtroom. Judges rarely stand up during preliminary hearings. He buttoned the top of his black robe, looking down at the entire room before locking eyes with me once again. A freight coordinator, the judge repeated quietly, almost to himself. He let out a small, breathless chuckle. I suppose that is the standard cover story they issue you boys these days. Clara's jaw practically hit the floor. She aggressively grabbed Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. She stared at the judge in absolute shock. For those in this courtroom completely unaware, Judge Vance announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. The code in this file indicates that the man sitting quietly at the defendant's table is a decorated operative of the Tier 1 Special Activities Division. That cheap fabric you are wearing is a specialized fire-retardant tactical weave. The judge paused, letting the heavy words sink into the silent room. He looked directly at the frayed cuff of my jacket. And I know for a fact, the judge continued softly, that a man with that specific verification code carries the Navy Cross securely pinned to the inside of that jacket, a medal awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could clearly hear the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the large wall clock. Clara turned her head slowly to look at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of pure terror, utter confusion, and total humiliation. The arrogant sneer was completely gone from her face, replaced by a pale, sickening realization of her own massive ignorance. Judge Vance stood completely straight, ignoring protocol, ignoring the gallery, and ignoring the aggressive lawyers. He placed his right hand firmly over his heart, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of ultimate, heavy respect. "Ma'am, counselor," the judge said, glaring at Clara and Richard. "We all salute you, Mr. Cross. Your father's will stands exactly as written. Case closed." He slammed the heavy gavel down one final time. The sharp crack echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung shut behind us with a loud, hollow thud. The hallway outside was a long stretch of polished marble and bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights. Clara stood frozen near the water fountain, her expensive white pantsuit suddenly looking absurdly out of place. Richard was frantically shuffling his legal briefs back into his leather briefcase, his face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson. He refused to look in my direction. The aggressive, high-powered legal team they had hired was already scurrying away toward the elevators, muttering quietly among themselves. I walked calmly toward the exit, my heavy, scuffed boots echoing steadily on the hard floor. I did not speed up. I did not slow down. "Julian!" Clara called out. Her voice was thin, completely stripped of its usual commanding volume. It sounded fragile, like a piece of dry glass about to shatter. I stopped and turned slowly. I kept my hands casually at my sides. My expression remained entirely neutral. I had seen enemies break under pressure countless times, and the signs were always the same: rapid blinking, erratic breathing, and a desperate need to fill the uncomfortable silence. She took a hesitant step forward, nervously twisting the diamond ring on her left hand. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "All these years, the freight company, the cheap car. You let me think you were a complete failure." "I never asked you to evaluate my success, Clara," I replied softly, my tone completely devoid of malice. "You made those assumptions entirely on your own." Richard snapped his briefcase shut with a loud, aggressive click. "It's completely ridiculous," he muttered, adjusting his silk tie nervously. "Hiding behind a fake job just to dramatically humiliate us in front of a federal judge. It was a calculated setup." I shifted my gaze from Clara to Richard. The sudden, intense focus of my eyes made him instinctively take a half step backward. The smug corporate lawyer was entirely out of his element now. "Rank isn't the point, Richard," I said quietly, the heavy weight of my voice carrying easily down the empty corridor. "I didn't wear this uniform today to embarrass anyone. I wore it because it is the only formal suit I own that truly means anything to me. I did not orchestrate that courtroom reveal. The judge simply recognized the clearance code. That is all. Clara stared at the frayed cuffs of my dark navy jacket. The same cuffs she had mocked so viciously just 24 hours earlier. She looked at the slight bulge near my left breast pocket, finally understanding the heavy, metallic truth hidden beneath the faded fabric. "I am sorry," she choked out, the words sounding entirely foreign and awkward coming from her lips. It was a forced, desperate attempt to regain some kind of emotional footing. I was trying to protect the family legacy, Father's estate." I let out a very small, quiet sigh. It was the only crack in my disciplined armor. "The legacy is safe, Clara. The northern acreage will remain exactly as Father intended. A quiet place." I turned and walked toward the heavy glass exit doors, leaving them both standing in the cold, echoing hallway. I pushed through the exit, stepping out into the bright, crisp morning air. The sudden release of tension was palpable. I walked toward my beat-up 10-year-old sedan, got in, and started the engine. The familiar rumble of the worn motor was deeply comforting. 3 days later, I was sitting at the small, scratched wooden table in my rented apartment. The room was sparsely furnished, completely devoid of the clutter and noise that most people use to fill their lives. I was carefully cleaning my old tactical boots with a damp cloth when my phone buzzed violently on the table. I checked the caller ID. It was Clara. I let it ring 3 times before slowly sliding my thumb across the glowing screen. I did not say hello. I simply held the phone to my ear, waiting for her to speak first. It was a basic negotiation tactic, but right now, it was just an old habit. "Julian?" she asked softly. The harsh, arrogant edge of the corporate executive was completely gone. "I am here," I replied evenly, continuing to wipe a stubborn scuff mark off the toe of my left boot. There was a long, heavy pause on the line. I could hear her taking a deep, shaky breath. "Richard and I are officially dropping all secondary claims against the estate," she said, her voice sounding incredibly tired. "The lawyers have been dismissed. The land is entirely yours to manage." "I appreciate that, Clara," I said quietly, setting the damp cloth down on the table. "I need to tell you something," she continued, her words rushing out in a sudden, nervous flood. "It wasn't just about the money, Julian. It was never really about the money. I hated how calm you always were. You never needed anything from anyone. You never asked for help. You never bragged. And you never fought back when I pushed you. It made me feel incredibly small." It was a stunning admission of deep, raw insecurity. The golden child, the ruthless CEO, finally dropping the heavy mask of arrogance to reveal the frightened, jealous sister underneath. "My silence was never meant as an insult to you," I explained calmly, my voice carrying a steady, emotional intelligence that I rarely displayed. "My life requires absolute discipline. If I lose control of my emotions, people die." I simply applied that same discipline to our arguments. "I understand that now," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "I was a complete fool." I looked out the small window of my apartment. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the city skyline. I had spent years operating in the darkest, most violent corners of the world, dealing with enemies who understood nothing but brutal force. But standing down, a family member required a completely different kind of strength. "Are you free for dinner on Thursday?" Clara asked suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. "Just you and me, no lawyers, no business." I paused, staring at the perfectly polished toe of my heavy tactical boot. A small, open loop remained in my mind. Would she actually be able to accept the quiet, dangerous man I truly was? Or was this just a temporary truce born out of courtroom humiliation? "Yes," I finally answered softly. "Thursday works." The grand wrought iron gates of Clara's estate swung open smoothly as my weathered sedan idled in the heavy evening rain. Thursday night had arrived, carrying a thick, unfamiliar tension. This was not a battlefield, nor was it a sterile federal courtroom. It was simply a dinner. Yet, the stakes felt strangely heavier than they had all week. I parked my car in the exact same spot I had occupied days earlier, The contrast between my faded vehicle and the pristine driveway remained, but this time, there was no arrogant corporate lawyer waiting at the door to mock it. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet, damp cabin for a moment, centering my breathing. I walked up the limestone steps, carrying a small, unadorned box wrapped in plain brown paper. I did not wear the dark navy uniform tonight. I wore a simple, neatly pressed gray button-down shirt and clean jeans. Before I could knock, the heavy mahogany door opened. Clara stood in the foyer alone. She was not wearing a sharp, custom-tailored designer suit. She wore a soft, oversized cashmere sweater, looking completely exhausted but genuinely relieved to see me. The harsh, commanding executive mask was gone. "Julian," she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. "Thank you for coming." I nodded silently, stepping onto the polished marble floor. The massive house felt remarkably different tonight. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of wealth and superiority had vanished. It was just a quiet, slightly lonely home. "Where is Richard?" I asked calmly, keeping my voice entirely neutral as I handed her the small wrapped box. "He had a late dinner meeting," Clara replied, her eyes dropping slightly. "Honestly, I asked him to stay away tonight. I needed to do this myself." She led me into the formal dining room. The private chef was absent. The long, transparent glass table was set for only two, and instead of a delicately arranged, pretentious meal, there was a simple, steaming pot of beef stew and a loaf of rustic bread. It was the exact meal our mother used to make when we were children. I sat down in the same high-backed chair I had occupied before, but the battle lines were completely erased. Clara took her seat across from me. She looked at the small brown box I had given her, carefully untying the simple string. She lifted the lid. Inside rested a small, smooth river stone, perfectly polished and deeply dark. "I found this on the northern acreage," I explained softly, breaking the heavy silence. "Right near the creek where Father used to take us fishing. I thought you should have a piece of the land, even if you cannot build on it." Clara stared at the smooth stone. A single tear slipped down her cheek, completely ruining her careful makeup. She did not bother wiping it away. "I am so incredibly sorry, Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking violently with genuine emotion. "I was a monster. I let my ego, my money, and my absolute arrogance completely blind me to who you are." "You only saw what I allowed you to see," I replied evenly, taking a piece of the warm bread. "My life requires shadows. I accept that burden." She shook her head, leaning forward across the table. "But I mocked you. I belittled you in my own home. I looked at your clothes and your car, and I judged your entire existence based on cotton and metal. When that judge stood up in the courtroom, when he saluted you, I felt smaller than I have ever felt in my entire life." I set my bread down, aligning it perfectly on the edge of my ceramic plate. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. "True power does not need to shout, Clara," I said quietly, the heavy weight of the words filling the large dining room. "It does not need expensive suits or massive bank accounts. It only requires discipline and the quiet resolve to do what is right when absolutely no one is watching." "I see that now," she admitted softly, clutching the small river stone tightly in her hand. "You have more honor in the frayed cuffs of that jacket than Richard and I have in our entire corporate empire." We ate the rest of the meal in a comfortable, healing silence. For the first time in over 20 years, we were simply a brother and a sister sharing a warm meal. The deep resentment that had poisoned our relationship for decades was slowly dissolving, replaced by a profound, heavy respect. An hour later, I stood at the heavy front doors, preparing to leave. The rain had stopped, leaving the night air crisp and clean. "Will you come back?" Clara asked hesitantly, leaning against the doorframe. "Maybe next week? We could actually talk about Father, properly this time." I looked out at my faded, reliable sedan waiting patiently in the driveway. I thought about the loud, chaotic world I often had to navigate and the quiet peace I had fought so hard to protect. "Yes," I replied softly, offering her a very small, rare smile. "Next week sounds fine." I walked down the limestone steps, the gravel crunching steadily beneath my heavy boots. I had not won a battle of money or prestige. I had won something much harder to achieve. I had won the quiet, enduring respect of my family. and I had done it without raising my voice once. If this story reminded you of someone who carries quiet strength, share it with someone who might need it. Follow along for more stories like this, and make sure to like and subscribe to Metal Truth Daily for more cinematic storytelling. Have you ever been underestimated before people knew your true story? What did you do?